Today we're going to talk about trait theories. These differ from previous personality sort of inventories because previously we had inner conflicts and desires in Freud, and then we had trying to reach your max potential in humanistic, and now we're looking at sort of these enduring characteristics of thought, action, and behavior. So that is what is known as a trait. So this is how we can describe our personality, sort of these enduring characteristics about ourselves. So Gordon Allport is the first person. He described personality in terms of fundamental traits, people's characteristic behaviors, and conscious motives. He actually figured this out when he was interviewing Freud, and Freud would not stop talking about internal, conflict and the id and the ego and the superego. And he was like, "Wow, this guy maybe just like keeps doing this. Maybe he's got a problem. Maybe he's got a trait that leads him to this." He was not concerned with explaining individual traits, but more like describing them. So Isabella Briggs Myers and her mother developed the 126 question Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. This is a personality sort of questionnaire and inventory that attempts to sort people according to Jung's personality types. Remember, Jung is a follower of Freud. So our technique of condensing a list of possible basic traits is called factor analysis. And so the way to do this is there's a bunch of different sort of behaviors that people might have. So for example, um, someone who describes themselves as liking excitement or liking practical jokes or disliking quiet reading. Well, all of these things are different behaviors, but we could factor them together into the personality type or trait, which is being outgoing. And so what that does is that takes all these varied behaviors that people have and it groups them in a way that's more helpful and useful for us. Um, and again, such a statistically correlated cluster of behaviors reflects a basic behavior or trait because generally people who like excitement also like practical jokes and they also dislike quiet reading. So all those things go together. You can group them together, and that's factor analysis. Hans and Sybil Eisnick reduced many of our normal individual variations to two or three dimensions in this what is called the Eisnick Personality Questionnaire. They believe these factors are genetically influenced, and to a certain extent, yes, you do get some of your personality from your parents. That's just the way it is. Now, what is important about them is they only use two factors. You're going to see that the common personality test nowadays is called the Big Five and uses five factors to identify people. Imagine you're trying to describe an apple, and you could describe an apple by one sort of characteristic, which is it on the spectrum? Is it red or is it green? And where does it fall in between that red or that green? And that will give you some description of an apple. But if let's bump it up to three. So we have red or green, we have big or small, and then we also have sweet to tart. Now, if you can use all three of those, and let's say like one of them is oriented vertically like this, another one's oriented like that, and another one's oriented like that, you can find somewhere in the middle where you have a better description of that apple. And that's the idea with our more modern personality indicators is nowadays we use five different sort of personality traits, whereas the Eysenck personality questionnaire only used two. So it's just more accurate. So here we can see this is the Myers-Briggs sort of setup. So you have, are you outwardly or inwardly focused? This is going to be extroversion versus introversion. Introversion is not shyness, contrary to popular belief. It is just how much you sort of like you essentially you experience more of the world inside your head than you do outside. Like an extroverted person actually will salivate less when they eat a lemon or something sour than an introverted person will. Which is pretty interesting to see. How do you prefer to take in information? Are you sensing or do you use intuition? How do you prefer to make decisions? Or do you think it through or do you just kind of feel it out? And then how do you perceive to live your outer life? Do you judge or do you perceive? And you can see these are all the different sort of outcomes that you can have based on this personality type. There's 16. I usually end up as an ENTP. They are all positive. They all have their strengths, so it's not like, oh crap, I got ISFP, I'm a bad person. Um, but some people will consider other personality traits to be stronger than others. They'll consider others to be like more desirable, especially extroversion. Here in America, we value extroversion much more than introversion. When that's not necessarily one's better than the other thing, but that's the way it is. Then here we have the Eysenck. So you can see it's only two sort of factors, introverted, extroverted, or unstable and stable. And you can see these are all the different ways we could describe someone who falls in between these two. An extroverted and stable person could be have leadership capability, they're carefree, they're easygoing, they're responsive, they're talkative, they're sociable. Whereas someone who's introverted and unstable, well, they would be anxious, rigid, pessimistic, reserved, unsociable. So it tried to use that factor analysis way to use these sort of trait words to describe people. Then we have more personality inventories. The first one is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. And this was actually originally designed to try to tap into emotional instability and emotional sort of problems. And it does that pretty well. It can identify emotional disorders, but it also identifies personality pretty well. Also, what is important about this and all of these is they are empirical. So remember, when it comes to the psychodynamic thematic apperception test or the Rorschach ink blot test, those are subjective. Tell me what this ink blot looks like. I think it looks like a rabbit. Well, I will now be subjective and talk about how I think that means that you are a murderer or something like that. All subjective. But when it comes to these tests, they are empirical, which means if two people answer the exact same questions on this test, they should get the exact same um, results. And that is what these are aiming to do, is try to make something valid. And it does to a certain extent, but keep in mind that these tests are only as accurate as the person who has given them. If you have a personality trait you don't like, and so you decide to answer questions on a personality inventory differently than how you actually feel, that's not going to be an accurate representation of your personality. And that is a big problem with all these inventories, is they're only as accurate as the person taking them. Expanding on his introverted, extroverted, stable, unstable factors, there is a complete big five: the conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. Conscientiousness is basically how put together you are, organized, sort of that sort of situation. Agreeableness is how open are you, how kind. Neuroticism is how stable versus unstable. Openness is how flexible you are, basically like how willing are you to change. And then extroversion is what we've talked about before. Never just one sneeze. This is currently our best approximation of basic trait dimensions, which is why you will see it on the AP exam. You got to know this, guys. So a good way to remember it is canoe, C-A-N-O-E. You can also remember it as ocean, O-C-E-A-N. But as long as you can remember all five of these, that is important. This is key, critical. Remember this one. Remember it. Important. What does this test tell us about people? Well, how stable are these traits? Actually, remarkably stable. These traits do not change throughout your life. In fact, they just get stronger as you get older. They are 40% heritable, which means that for a group of people, we can account for about 40% of like their personality coming from their parents. They do reflect different brain structures. People who are extroverted actually have less activity in their frontal lobes, and that does not mean that they're dumb or not as smart. That just means that they have less repression of their impulses. Their impulses just kind of go, whereas an introverted person will repress them. Nothing to do with birth order. Firstborns are not more introverted. Middleborns are not extroverted or whatever it is. That's not the case. So nothing to do with birth order. People always say the firstborn is this way. Not the case. Um, how well do these traits apply to various cultures? They are stable across cultures, almost across the entire world. And then how well do they predict our actual behaviors? Well, they could predict on average our behaviors. Well, this person is generally going to be this way, but unfortunately, it is not perfect. We are unpredictable creatures, right? Um, Scientists can predict phases of the moon, you know, hundreds of years into the future, and meteorologists can now accurately predict the weather days into the future. But you can't predict what a person is going to do based on their personality. You can give your best guess on what they're going to be like, but they're not always going to be that way. There's this thing called the person situation controversy, and the problem with that is a person may be agreeable, right? They may be soft-hearted, trusting, and helpful, and they generally are that way. But something really sets them off, and all of a sudden they start acting ruthless, suspicious, uncooperative. Somewhat they see something that really pisses them off, and they start acting in a way they don't normally do. That's possible. People do not always act on their traits. Their traits are just a best approximation of how that person will act on average. So that can make it difficult to sort of figure out and reckon with. But we'll take a look here. Or not take a look here, but you can understand how this is like most of the time you're going to act this way, but not always. I'm going to include with this video a link to a test for the Big Five personality factors. Do it if you want. I think it's fun. I'll post my results somewhere on here. Maybe I'll post them along with the video or along with the test itself. But it's interesting. Take it. Doesn't take that long, and figure out sort of where you fall and see if you agree with it or not. I'll see you guys in the Zoom tomorrow. Thank you guys so much. Have a good day.